She was only the girl who poured the water, an invisible figure, a trembling nobody. At least, that is what everyone believed. This is a story about how power is the only real protection in the world, and what happens when someone powerless finds their voice. You need to listen closely. The night that the King of Sicily, Don Salvatore Moretti, entered Il Giglio, all the air was sucked from the room. Men who had taken lives without a second thought were now sweating through their expensive tailored suits. Yet when the timid waitress came to the table, she did not drop a single glass or allow her voice to stutter. She met the eyes of the most dangerous man in the city and said 5 simple words. They were spoken in a dialect that had not been heard outside the rugged hills of Corleone since 1990. The entire room did not just fall silent. It became frozen in time. Because what she said was not a simple greeting. It was a declaration of war, a death sentence, and in that entire restaurant, only 3 people understood exactly why. This is the true story of Sophia, the waitress who concealed an entire kingdom underneath her server's apron. If you've ever been dismissed as nobody, underestimated, or made to feel invisible, this story is for you. Stay until the very end. The dinner service at Il Giglio was not so much a meal as it was a carefully orchestrated panic attack. Located in the very core of Manhattan's financial district, the restaurant was a towering cathedral built of marble, rich mahogany, and ancient money. It was the type of establishment where a single bottle of wine cost significantly more than Sophia's monthly rent, and the wealthy clientele spoke in quiet, hushed tones about corporate mergers, hostile acquisitions, and other business deals that would put any normal person behind the bars of a federal prison. Sophia Rossi pulled the strings of her apron tighter, feeling them press sharply into her waist. She briefly checked her image in the gleaming, polished brass of the enormous espresso machine. She saw dark, bruised-looking circles beneath her eyes, her hair pulled back into a messy bun, and a uniform that was clearly one size too large. She looked exactly like the person she was trying so hard to be, completely and utterly forgettable. "Rossi, table 4 is waiting for water. Now." The floor manager, a perspiring man named Mr. Henderson, who always smelled like stale coffee and quiet desperation, snapped his fingers right in front of her face. "Yes, sir, I am going right away," Sophia whispered, her gaze fixed firmly on her own worn-out shoes. She drifted through the grand dining room like a phantom, a ghost among the living. That was her special talent. She had discovered a very long time ago that true survival depended on never being seen. If you remained invisible, then no one could ever hurt you. If you were always quiet, you could never become a target. For 3 long years, she had been a ghost living in New York City. She paid for her small sublet in Queens with cash, worked jobs that paid her under the table, and she never, ever made eye contact with anyone for more than a second. But this particular night, the very air in Il Giglio felt thick and heavy. It was not the standard tension of a busy Friday evening. This feeling was denser, sharper, and filled with dread. The entire kitchen staff had been nervous and on edge since 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The head chef, a famously temperamental man from France who typically threw plates for entertainment, was now silently and meticulously wiping down his own counters. "A very big party is coming in tonight," Marco, one of the younger busboys, whispered as he loaded a heavy tray right next to Sophia. "The owner himself called," he said, his voice low. "Told us to clear the whole VIP mezzanine." Sophia felt a cold prickle of deep unease travel up the base of her neck. Who could it be, a senator? Marco just shook his head, his eyes growing wide with a mix of fear and excitement. "Much bigger, it is the Morettis." The water glass in Sophia's hand slipped just an inch, but she managed to catch it before it fell. A small splash of icy water hit the back of her wrist, feeling like a burn. Moretti. In some neighborhoods, that name was spoken like a venomous curse word. In the pages of the newspaper, they were described as waste management consultants or successful shipping magnates. But in the dark, shadowy corners of the city where Sophia worked so hard to avoid, they were the ultimate law. Dante Moretti was the modern face of the new generation, handsome, incredibly brutal, and ruthlessly corporate. But if the staff was clearing the entire mezzanine, that could only mean the old guard was coming to town. I really need to go on my break, Sophia said, her voice shaking just a little. There are no breaks, Henderson barked from across the room. They are here. Everyone line up by the stairs. Now! Sophia's heart began to beat violently against her ribs, like a terrified bird trapped inside a small cage. She knew she could not leave now. If she tried to run, it would immediately draw attention to her, and she knew that to be noticed was to die. She slowly took her place at the very end of the service line, keeping her head bowed low, and she began to pray to a God she had not spoken to in many years, hoping that she would remain invisible for just a little longer. The large front doors swung open with a sudden gust of wind, and the temperature in the entire room seemed to drop by 10 degrees. First, the security team entered, 4 massive men who looked as if they had been carved directly out of granite, their dead eyes scanning every corner of the room. Following them was Dante Moretti. Sophia dared to take a quick look through her eyelashes. He was terrifyingly handsome, dressed in a charcoal suit that fit his body like a second skin. He moved with the smooth, predatory grace of a panther, his dark hair slicked back perfectly, his jaw set in a hard line of grim determination. He appeared to be a man who was completely bored by violence, but also exceptionally good at it. But the room did not freeze for Dante. It froze for the older man who walked slowly behind him. Don Salvatore Moretti, the capo di capi of the old world. He was in his late 60s, and he leaned heavily on a dark ebony cane that was topped with a silver lion's head. He wore an old-fashioned fedora and a long wool coat, looking like a ghost from a different, more brutal time. His face was a roadmap of old scars and deep wrinkles, his eyes concealed behind dark-tinted glasses. A profound silence fell over the entire restaurant. Forks paused in midair. Conversations simply died away. Mr. Henderson was practically shaking with nervous energy. "Welcome, Don Moretti. Mr. Moretti. It is a true honor." Dante simply raised one hand, silencing him immediately. "The table. Now." "Of course. Right this way, please." As the procession of dangerous men moved past the line of staff, Sophia held her breath, chanting in her head, "Don't look up. Do not look up. Do not dare look up." And then, Don Salvatore stopped. He was standing directly in front of her. The strong scent of expensive cigars and old, worn leather washed over her senses. Sophia kept her eyes fixed on the perfectly polished leather tips of his shoes. "This one," Salvatore said, his voice deep and raspy, like grinding gravel. "She is shaking." Dante let out a quiet sigh, sounding utterly exhausted. "Papa, please, let us just sit down. The girl is simply nervous." "Fear is a good thing," Salvatore murmured softly. He then reached out and tapped Sophia's shoe with the tip of his cane. "Look at me, bambina." Sophia squeezed her eyes shut for a single, fleeting microsecond, gathering every single ounce of the character she had so carefully built. The shy, terrified, completely insignificant girl. She slowly raised her head, widening her eyes, and purposefully let her lower lip tremble. "I am so sorry, sir," she stammered, making her voice higher and softer than it normally was. I have never seen a real famous person before." Salvatore just stared at her, his dark and piercingly intelligent eyes boring into hers. For one terrifying second, Sophia was sure that he could see right through her cheap uniform, right through the mask of fear. He saw all the way down to the very blood that ran in her veins. And then he laughed. It was a dry, wheezing sound. "Famous? Yes. Now, bring us the wine, little mouse, and be careful not to drop it." They all moved on toward the table. Sophia finally let out a slow breath, realizing that her knees were literally knocking against each other. She had managed to survive their arrival, but she knew with a sinking feeling that the long night had only just started. Dante Moretti unbuttoned the jacket of his suit as he sat down, his eyes constantly scanning the mezzanine. It was secure. His men were positioned at the top of the stairwell and at the kitchen entrance. Even so, he could not bring himself to relax. Having his father visit him in New York was always a logistical nightmare. Salvatore simply did not understand that the world had moved on. He had no concern for RICO acts or modern surveillance cameras. He only wanted respect. He wanted his wine, and he wanted to criticize Dante's management of the American branch of the family business. The architecture in here is soulless, Salvatore grumbled, gesturing vaguely with a dismissive hand at the high ornate ceilings. It is like eating inside of a bank. You eat in a bank, Dante? It is modern, Papa. It is what people like these days, Dante replied, trying to signal the sommelier over. He did not actually want the sommelier. He wanted a double scotch, neat. But he knew tonight was all about upholding tradition. People like what we tell them to like, Salvatore corrected him sharply. He glanced around the large table. His old consigliere, Rocco, and two of his personal Sicilian guards sat there in complete silence. Where is the mouse? I want my wine. Dante signaled to Henderson, who then frantically pushed the terrified-looking waitress toward the mezzanine stairs. Dante watched her as she approached the table. She was small and pale, with wide, frantic brown eyes. She was holding the heavy bottle of Barolo as if it were an active bomb. She is going to faint right here, Dante thought to himself. Wonderful. Just another mess that I will have to clean up. Open it, Salvatore commanded in a low voice. As Sophia finally reached the table, her hands were visibly shaking. But as Dante continued to watch her, he noticed something peculiar. The very moment the corkscrew made contact with the bottle, the shaking completely stopped. Her movements suddenly became precise and fluid. The leverage she used was perfect. The pop of the cork was barely a whisper. It was a completely professional pour. She did not spill a single drop of the expensive wine. Interesting, Dante thought. Nerves of steel once the work actually begins. She carefully placed the full glass in front of Salvatore. The old Don swirled the dark red wine, took a long sniff of its aroma, and then looked up at her, a mischievous, cruel glint appearing in his eye. He was testing her. He always tested the help. It was a small power play that he clearly enjoyed, making the common people squirm under his gaze. You are Italian? Salvatore asked her in English. Yes, sir. My grandmother was, she whispered. Where from? Naples, sir. Salvatore scoffed loudly, waving his hand in a dismissive gesture. Naples. They are noisy people, nothing but thieves and singers. Dante clearly saw the waitress's jaw tighten. It was only for a fraction of a second, a tiny flicker of something that was definitely not fear. It almost looked like insulted pride. Salvatore then leaned forward, switching his language to standard Italian. Do you understand this? Or are you just another American girl who has a vowel at the end of her name? Sophia lowered her head respectfully. I understand a little, signore, she replied in passable, though clearly broken, Italian. Salvatore smirked at her response. He then turned to his old friend Rocco, switching languages once again. This time, however, he did not speak English or standard Italian. He slipped into the heavy, thick dialect of the Sicilian interior, using a very localized slang from the mountains near Corleone. It was the ancient language of shepherds and bandits, a dialect that was completely incomprehensible even to most other Italians. Look at her, Rocco, Salvatore said in the dialect, a cruel grin spreading across his face. A pretty face, but her eyes are empty. She is like a sheep waiting for the butcher. He continued. We could take her back to the villa. She would warm a bed for a night quite nicely before we decide to discard her. It was a crude and brutal test of his surroundings. Salvatore often said shocking things in his dialect just to see if anyone in the room would flinch. If they reacted, he knew they were listening. If they showed no reaction, they were safe. Dante immediately stiffened in his chair. He truly hated when his father spoke like that. "Papa, that is enough," he warned him in English. But then, the unthinkable happened. Sophia was backing away from the table, clutching the empty tray to her chest like a shield. She should have just kept walking away. She should have continued to be the invisible girl. But the insult, the specific and vulgar phrasing about being a sheep meant for the butcher, struck a deep, forgotten chord inside of her that completely bypassed her survival instinct. She stopped moving. She slowly turned back to face the table. The silence that fell over the men was absolute. Dante stared at her, completely confused. Was she about to start crying? But Sophia just looked directly at. She spoke his name. Salvatore. In that single moment, all the fear evaporated from her face, replaced by something cold and powerful. Her posture underwent a complete transformation. Her spine straightened, her chin rose with an air of command, and for a terrifying, heart-stopping second, she appeared to be nothing less than royalty. When she spoke again, the sound that emerged was not the timid, high-pitched whisper of the waitress they knew. It was a deep, guttural tone, a perfect, rhythmic cadence that resonated with ancient power. "The sheep that manages to survive," she declared, "is the one that watches the wolf as it sleeps. Don Salvatore, a guest who dares to insult the bread of his host, will eat nothing but ashes in the morning." She was speaking in his own dialect, not merely Sicilian, but his family's specific tongue. The archaic, precise phrasing used only within the Moretti stronghold. It was a turn of phrase that employed words which had not been in common use since the 1970s. The silence was shattered by a sudden, deafening crash. Rocco's fork had slipped from his nerveless fingers and clattered loudly against the fine china plate. At the far end of the long table, the two bodyguards reacted instantly, their hands plunging inside their jackets as their gazes fixed intently on Sophia. But Dante remained completely still. He found he could not move. His eyes were locked on his father. For the very first time in Dante's entire life, he witnessed Don Salvatore Moretti looking utterly and profoundly stunned. The old Don's mouth was slightly agape, a portrait of disbelief. Every bit of color had drained from his weathered face. He stared at Sophia, no longer seeing a waitress, but looking at her as if he were seeing a specter from the grave. "Who are you?" Salvatore finally whispered, his powerful voice now trembling with shock. The moment shattered. The spell was broken. Sophia's eyes widened in horror as the full weight of what she had just done crashed down upon her. The mask had not just slipped, it had fallen away completely. She had just revealed her true self in the presence of the most dangerous and unforgiving family on the planet. I need to go get the antipasto," she stammered, the words catching in her throat. She spun around and fled. This was not a quick walk or a hurried retreat. She sprinted with desperate speed toward the safety of the kitchen doors. "Get her!" Salvatore roared, his voice thundering through the room as he slammed his heavy cane down on the table, the impact shattering a crystal wine glass. "Bring her to me this instant!" Dante was already rising from his chair. "Stay put," he commanded his men, his mind racing 1,000 miles an hour. He vaulted effortlessly over the low decorative railing of the mezzanine and took off in pursuit of the mysterious waitress. He slammed through the swinging kitchen doors just in time to see the restaurant's back door swinging closed behind her. "Move!" Dante yelled, forcefully shoving a terrified sous chef out of his path. He kicked the heavy back door open and burst out into the dark, rain-slicked alleyway. His head snapped left, then right, scanning the darkness. At the far end of the narrow passage, he spotted her. She was moving incredibly fast. She was scaling a tall chain-link fence with a fluid agility that no ordinary waitress should ever possess. "Stop!" Dante shouted, his hand moving on pure instinct to the holstered firearm secured at the small of his back. She hesitated for a fraction of a second at the very top of the fence, glancing back over her shoulder at him. Underneath the harsh, sickly yellow glow of a distant street lamp, their eyes met across the alley. Dante had expected to see raw terror in her gaze. Instead, he was confronted with cool, sharp calculation. She was not fleeing like a helpless victim. She was executing a tactical retreat, like a trained soldier. "You have no idea what you have just done," Dante called out to her, taking a cautious step forward. "I know exactly who you are, Dante Moretti," she yelled back, her voice ringing out, astonishingly clear and steady despite her exertion. "And I know that if your father discovers who I truly am, he will not just kill me. He will burn this entire city to the ground to hide his secrets." She dropped down onto the other side of the fence and was immediately swallowed by the shadows of the night. Dante stood there alone in the downpour, pure adrenaline coursing through his veins. He raised a hand and touched his earpiece. "Boss!" The voice of his head of security crackled urgently in his ear. "Should we lock down the entire restaurant?" "Forget the restaurant," Dante growled, his eyes fixed on the empty fence where she had been moments before. "Find that girl. I want to know everything about her, and under no circumstances are you to let my father get to her before I do." Sophia did not stop running until her lungs felt like they had swallowed fire and her legs burned with exhaustion. She navigated the labyrinthine streets of Tribeca, zigzagging through the maze, deliberately doubling back through dark alleys, and cutting through a busy subway station without ever stepping onto a train, finally emerging a full 6 blocks from where she started. She slipped into the relative anonymity of a 24-hour laundromat, collapsing onto a hard plastic chair in the far back corner, effectively hidden from the street by a long row of churning, vibrating dryers. She pressed her forehead hard against her knees, trying desperately to will the violent shaking in her hands to stop. Stupid, so incredibly stupid. 3 years of painstaking hiding, 3 years of dyeing her hair this unremarkable mousy brown, 3 years of wearing baggy, shapeless clothes that completely concealed her figure, of ruthlessly suppressing the fiery spirit that was her birthright. And in a single reckless moment, she had thrown it all away over a simple insult. But it had not been just an insult, had it? It was hearing that specific dialect. It had triggered something deep inside her, a muscle memory, a visceral, automatic reaction from a childhood that she had fought so hard to bury and forget. Her phone buzzed insistently in her pocket. It was a burner phone, a cheap, prepaid flip phone she kept only for the most dire emergencies. Just one person in the world had this number. She flipped it open with a trembling hand. A single text message was on the screen. "They are looking. Leave the apartment now." Sophia stared at the glowing words. With a surge of frustrated anger, she crushed the flimsy phone in her hand, snapped the small SIM card in two, and tossed the broken pieces into a nearby trash can filled with discarded dryer sheets. She could never go back to her place in Queens. Her apartment was now compromised. Her entire stash of emergency cash was hidden under the floorboards there, along with the forged passport that identified her as Maria Fiore. Now she was Sophia Rossi once more. Or more accurately, she was forced to become who she was always born to be. She quickly checked her pockets, taking inventory. $50 in tips, the key to her locker at the restaurant, and the small pocket knife she never went anywhere without. "Okay," she whispered to the humming chorus of the washing machines. "Think. What would Papa have done in this situation?" The mere thought of her father brought a fresh, sharp wave of pain. Do not think about the blood. Think about the lesson. Lesson number 4. When the wolf is on your trail, you do not run back to the den for safety. You run toward the water. She pushed herself to her feet, wiped the tear streaks from her face, and walked with renewed purpose out of the laundromat. She had a new destination. She needed to get to the docks in Red Hook. An old associate of her father's was there, a man who owed her family a debt so profound that even death had not cancelled it. Meanwhile, back at the restaurant Il Giulio, the atmosphere had become as grim and silent as a funeral. The entire building had been completely cleared of patrons. The terrified staff were being held in the main kitchen, their cell phones confiscated and placed in a pile. Dante paced restlessly in the private dining room, his attention fixed on his father. Don Salvatore was seated in a large chair, staring intently at a blank wall as if seeing images there. He looked a decade older than he had just an hour before. He was drinking grappa, and Dante noted that his hand trembled slightly as he held the glass. "Papa," Dante began, keeping his voice deliberately low and calm. "The boys are already scrubbing all the CCTV footage from tonight. We managed to get a trace on her employee file, but it was a dead end. Fake social security number, a completely fabricated address. As far as the system is concerned, she is a ghost." Salvatore did not even look up from the wall. "She spoke the arbores of the inner circle, Dante. It was not just the dialect, it was the code." "I heard her," Dante confirmed, pouring a drink for himself as well. "She issued a threat against you. She said you would eat ash." "No," Salvatore corrected him, his tone suddenly sharp and cutting. "That was not a threat. It was a proverb. A guest who insults the host's bread. It is an old saying, something the wives of the capos used to say to the young, arrogant men when they became too full of themselves. It is a phrase of correction, Dante, a phrase of authority." Salvatore finally turned to look at his son, and his eyes were filled with a haunted, distant look. Only one family ever used that precise phrasing: the Valentis. Dante froze in place. The glass he was raising stopped halfway to his lips. "The Valentis are all dead. You killed them. Every last one. The night of the long knives, back in 1998. You wiped out their entire bloodline." "That is what I thought I did," Salvatore whispered, his voice raspy. "Giovanni Valente. He had a daughter. Her name was Sofia. She was only 12 years old when their villa burned to the ground. We found the remains of a child. The teeth were a perfect match for her dental records." "Dental records can easily be faked if you have enough money and influence," Dante countered, his mind racing to connect the impossible dots. The Valentis were the only family in history that had ever truly challenged the Moretti clan for the throne of Sicily. They were an ancient line, known for being both ruthless and possessing a code of honor that the modern mob no longer understood. "If that girl is truly Sofia Valente," Salvatore said, his voice hardening into cold steel as the shock wore off, "then she is the rightful heir to a blood feud that demands my head on a platter. And she has been in my restaurant, serving me water. For how long?" "6 months," Dante replied. A cold sweat broke out across his skin. He had walked past her nearly every single day. He had barely even noticed her. And during all of that time, she could have put poison in his food, slipped a knife between his ribs, or burned the entire establishment to the ground. Why had she not done anything? "Find her, Dante," Salvatore commanded, pushing himself to his feet and leaning heavily on his ornate cane. The momentary frailty was gone. The old lion was back in control. "Find her before the Russos or any of our rivals discover that she exists. If our enemies learn that a Valente is still alive, they will flock to her banner. It will ignite a civil war." "I will bring her to you," Dante promised solemnly. "Alive," Salvatore added, his voice a low growl. "I want to look directly into her eyes when I finally finish the work I started 20 years ago." Dante gave a single firm nod and turned to depart, but as he stepped out into the cool, rain-washed night air, he made a silent, personal decision. He would undoubtedly find Sofia Valente. However, he was no longer certain that he was going to deliver her to his father. Because for the first time in his privileged and predictable life, Dante Moretti was genuinely intrigued. And for a man who already had everything he could ever want, a true mystery was the only prize worth chasing. The rain in New York City never washes things clean. It just makes all the existing grime on the streets slicker and more treacherous. By the time Sophia finally reached the industrial waterfront of Red Hook, the relentless storm had transformed the cityscape into a blurred, abstract watercolor of smeared neon and oppressive gray. The docks were a veritable graveyard of rusted-out shipping containers and massive cranes that loomed like the skeletal remains of long-dead prehistoric beasts. She limped unevenly toward a dilapidated bait and tackle shop situated at the very edge of Pier 41. To any casual observer, the place looked completely abandoned. The windows were boarded up with weathered plywood that had started to rot around the rusting nails. But Sophia knew the truth. She knew that 3 feet below the murky waterline, there was a sophisticated pressure sensor. If you failed to knock on the front door using the correct, precise rhythm, 2 quick taps, a pause, 1 slow thud, then 3 more fast taps, a shotgun rigged just behind the doorframe would instantly turn your chest into a bloody pulp. She raised her fist and knocked. Rat-a-tat. Thud. Rat-a-tat-tat. A long, tense silence hung in the air, broken only by the sound of the rain. Then came the grating screech of a heavy, rusty deadbolt being reluctantly slid back. The door cracked open just enough to reveal a sliver of absolute darkness and the menacing, oily gleam of a Remington 870's barrel. "We are closed," a voice rasped out from the shadows. It sounded like heavy iron chains being dragged across a rough concrete floor. "The tide is high, Enzo," Sophia said, keeping her voice remarkably steady, despite the uncontrollable shivering of her cold, exhausted body. "But the fish are not biting tonight." The shotgun barrel lowered instantly. The heavy door swung inward with a groan. Enzo the butcher stood in the doorway. He had to be 70 years old, wearing a grease-stained tank top that showed off arms covered in the faded blue-green ink of old tattoos. He had been her father's most loyal and trusted lieutenant, the very man who had smuggled her out of Sicily all those years ago, wrapping her small body in a heavy rug and hiding her on a fishing trawler the night her entire family was murdered. "Sophia," he breathed out, his eyes stretching wide in disbelief. He quickly pulled her into the room and shut the heavy door behind her, the sound of 3 separate locks clicking into place echoing in the small space. "My God, I was certain you were in Queens. I believed you were out of harm's way." "I was," Sophia answered, her body sliding down a stack of lobster traps until she was crumpled on the cold, wet floor. "I was safe, right up until tonight. I saw him, Enzo. I saw Salvatore." The color drained from Enzo's face. He rushed to her side, pressing a worn, ragged towel and a bottle of harsh brandy into her hands. "You saw him? Did he recognize you? Did he see who you were?" "He saw a waitress," Sophia said, the cheap liquor burning a trail down her throat as she took a long swallow. "But then he insulted the family, and he used the old dialect. I could not stop myself, Enzo. I responded to him." Enzo squeezed his eyes shut and muttered a soft curse in Italian. "You spoke back to the devil in his own language. Now the entire pack will be on the hunt for you." "I need the package, Enzo," she stated, her gaze locking with his. "I need the one that Papa left for me." Enzo froze, a deep hesitation in his eyes. He looked down at the girl he had spent 20 years protecting from the shadows of her own family. "This is a suicide mission, Sophia. If you open that box, you can never go back to being a simple waitress. You become the Dawn again. You become the primary target for everyone." "I am already the target," she replied, pushing herself to her feet. The bone-deep exhaustion seemed to melt away from her, replaced by an ice-cold, razor-sharp anger. "Give it to me." Enzo let out a long sigh, completely defeated by the fire in her eyes. It was the exact same expression her father, Giovanni Valente, always had just before he gave the order for a man to die. He moved behind the bait counter and used a knife to pry up a loose floorboard. From the dark space beneath, he lifted out a heavy steel briefcase that had been carefully wrapped in oilcloth. He set it on the counter with a heavy thud. Sophia slowly ran her fingers across the cold, smooth metal. Inside that case was everything: the access codes to the Valente family's offshore accounts, the complete contact list of sleeper agents her father had planted all across Europe, and the most critical piece of all, the Libro Rosso, the Red Book. That book held the proof of every single bribe, every murder, and every act of betrayal committed by the other 5 families over the past 30 years. It was the ultimate leverage, a weapon of mass destruction. "Take it," Enzo said, his voice heavy. There is a boat waiting at the very end of the pier. The key to the Lucia is hidden under the mat. You need to go to Jersey. I will do my best to hold them off if they show up here. They will not come for you, Enzo, she said, her voice turning soft. They do not even know you are alive. Crash. The skylight directly above them exploded into 1,000 pieces. Shards of glass rained down around them like sharp, deadly diamonds. Thick ropes dropped from the ceiling beams above. Before Enzo could even lift his shotgun, a flashbang grenade landed and detonated right in the middle of the room. The entire world turned into a blinding white light. A piercing, high-pitched scream filled Sophia's ears. The force of the blast threw her backward into the stack of lobster traps, knocking all the air from her lungs. Through the thick smoke and the painful ringing, she could see dark shadows dropping down from the ceiling. They were covered in tactical gear, wearing night vision goggles, and their weapons were fitted with suppressors. This was not the police, and these were not the Moretti family's street thugs. This was a team with high-end military precision. Enzo let out a roar of defiance, firing his shotgun blindly into the swirling smoke. Boom! One of the shadows fell to the ground, but then 3 distinct red laser dots converged right on Enzo's chest. No! Sophia screamed out, scrambling desperately for the briefcase. Thip! 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 The suppressed shots were quiet but final. Enzo's body jerked backward as 3 small holes appeared in his chest. He slumped forward over the counter, already dead before his head hit the scarred wood. Sophia had no time to grieve. Pure, raw instinct took complete control. She grabbed the handle of the steel briefcase and threw her body to the right, just as a spray of bullets tore up the floor where she had been a second before. She scrambled for cover behind a heavy, industrial-sized freezer, her mind screaming one thought: the back door. She had to get to the back door. She kicked the freezer's heavy door open, using it as a temporary shield, and bolted for the rear exit. Bullets sparked off the metal doorframe as she burst out into the night and onto the rotting wood of the pier. The rain had become a torrential downpour now. The wind howled like a hungry animal. She sprinted with all her might toward the Lucia, a small fishing boat that was bobbing violently in the choppy water. "There is nowhere left to run, Principessa," a voice shouted, cutting through the storm. Sophia skidded to a sudden stop. Standing directly between her and the boat was Dante Moretti. He was completely alone. He held a handgun loosely at his side, the barrel pointed down at the pier. He was not wearing any tactical gear. He was soaked to the bone in his expensive ruined suit, his dark hair plastered against his forehead. "You led them straight to me," Sophia spat out, clutching the briefcase tightly to her chest as she began to back away toward the dangerous edge of the pier. "I did not lead anyone," Dante shouted back over the wind, taking a careful step forward. "I came here by myself. Look at them, Sophia. Those men are not with me." Sophia risked a quick glance back at the bait shop. The tactical team was now pouring out of the back door. They were raising their weapons, and she saw with a jolt of shock that they were aiming not just at her, but at Dante as well. "Drop the weapon, Moretti," the lead commando shouted, his voice amplified and metallic, "or we have orders to clean the whole slate." Dante's face showed a flicker of complete confusion, just for a fraction of a second. "What?" "It is a coup, you absolute idiot," Sophia yelled at him. "Duck!" She did not run. She did not dive into the water. Instead, she reached into her apron pocket. She was somehow still wearing the ridiculous waitress apron. She pulled out the second flashbang, the one she had swiped from the floor of the bait shop right after the first soldier had gone down. She pulled the pin with her teeth and lobbed it in a high arc over Dante's head, aiming it perfectly at the tactical team. Bang! The world exploded in light again. Dante flinched away, instinctively shielding his eyes from the blast. When he could see again, the tactical team was in disarray, stumbling around, completely blinded. "Move!" Sophia screamed. She grabbed Dante by the lapel of his expensive suit and started dragging him forcefully toward the edge of the pier. "What in the hell are you doing?" Dante yelled, struggling against her grip. "I am saving your life now, so I can have the pleasure of killing you myself later." With that, she shoved him with all her strength. Dante stumbled backward off the edge of the pier, hitting the freezing, oily water of the Hudson River with a huge splash. Sophia clutched the heavy briefcase and jumped in right after him. Bullets ripped into the water's surface just above their heads, leaving behind trails of bubbles that looked like angry hornets. But the dark, churning current of the Hudson quickly swallowed them both whole. The area under Pier 41 was a dense forest of rotting wooden pilings covered in sharp barnacles. The smell was a toxic combination of raw sewage and gasoline. Dante Moretti broke the surface, gasping for air in the oppressive gloom beneath the pier. The water was so cold it felt like being stabbed with 1,000 knives. He thrashed in the water, trying desperately to get a grip on a slippery crossbeam. "Be quiet," a voice hissed out from the darkness nearby. He froze instantly. Sophia was clinging to a piling just 3 feet away from him. The steel briefcase was now strapped securely to her wrist with her own belt. She was shivering violently, her thin waitress uniform plastered to her skin, but her eyes were sharp and focused on the narrow gaps in the floorboards directly above them. The heavy thud of combat boots stomped overhead. Bright beams from flashlights cut through the cracks in the wood, slicing into the darkness below like swords. "Clear," a voice echoed from above them. "They went under. The current has them by now. Deploy the thermal drone." "Thermal," Dante whispered, a wave of pure panic rising in his chest. "We need to get out of here right now." "Shut up," Sophia snapped, her voice low and sharp. "Follow my lead. Stay as low as you can. If you make a splash, I will leave you here to die." She pushed off from the piling, moving through the water with a silent, frog-like stroke, heading deeper into the dark labyrinth of the underpier. Dante followed her, his large muscles already starting to seize up from the intense cold. He was a trained boxer, a skilled shooter, a man who spent 2 hours every day in the gym, but he was struggling to keep up with the slender girl who had just served him wine 2 hours ago. She guided him to a rusted maintenance ladder that was covered in green algae. They climbed up and into a storm-drained tunnel that ran underneath the West Side Highway. It was mostly dry inside, and it smelled of damp earth and rats. They both collapsed onto a concrete ledge, gasping for breath, their bodies shaking. Dante rolled onto his back, staring up at the curved, dark ceiling. "Those men," he said between breaths. "They were wearing Russian gear, but they spoke English. They had American accents." "Mercenaries," Sophia said, wringing the filthy water from her hair. She quickly checked the briefcase. The seal was still tight. "They are high-end private contractors." "Who hired them?" Dante asked, pushing himself into a sitting position. "My father?" Sophia let out a laugh. It was a harsh, bitter sound with no humor in it. "Your father wants the satisfaction of killing me himself. He would never send a faceless hit squad to blow up a bait shop. He is old school. He would want to look me directly in the eye." She turned to face him fully, the dim light from a street grate above them casting deep shadows across her face. "And they also tried to kill you, Dante. You saw the lasers. If I had not thrown that flashbang, your brains would be painting the docks right now." Dante fell silent. He knew she was right. The order had been to clean the slate. "Someone wants to start a war," Dante said slowly, the pieces finally starting to click together in his mind. "If I die, and the last Valente dies on the same night, who benefits from that?" "Chaos always benefits the hungry," Sophia said, quoting another one of her father's proverbs. She shivered again, wrapping her arms tightly around herself. "The Russos are too stupid to pull off something with this level of precision. The Castellos are too broke to afford it." "It is someone on the inside," Dante realized, and the thought tasted like bile in his mouth. "It is someone who knew exactly where I was going tonight. Only 3 people knew I was tracking you to Red Hook." "Your father," Sophia listed off. "No," Dante insisted. He would not kill me. You're head of security, Thorn. Dante shook his head again. Thorn took a bullet for me last year. The man is loyal. Loyalty has an expiration date when the paycheck is big enough, Sophia countered, her voice cold. Who else knew? Dante hesitated for a long moment. Rocco, he finally said. The consigliere. Sophia's eyes narrowed into slits. Rocco, the man who sat at your father's table tonight, the one who laughed when your father called me a sheep. He has been with the family since before I was born, Dante said, his voice defensive. Which means he remembers the old days, Sophia shot back. He remembers when the Morettis were kings, not corporate chief executive officers like you. Maybe he thinks you have gone soft, Dante. Maybe he thinks your father is too old to rule. Maybe he wants the crown for himself. Dante shot to his feet, pacing back and forth in the cramped tunnel. I need a phone. I have to call this in. If you call anyone, you will die, Sophia said, her voice completely calm. They can track your voice print. They can triangulate your signal in seconds. If Rocco is really behind this, he has access to the National Security Agency level technology your family bought last year. Dante stopped pacing and just looked at her. He really looked at her for the first time in the dim light, with dirt smudged on her face and a stolen steel briefcase in her lap. She was not the shy, nervous waitress from the restaurant. She was a general planning a war. You know a surprising amount about our operations for a girl who just busses tables, Dante said, a clear note of admiration in his voice that was filled with cold certainty. For 3 long years, I have made you my entire world, Sophia stated, her voice level and devoid of emotion. I know the restaurants where you conduct business, the names of the people you share your bed with, and the secret accounts where you stash your family's fortune. That was the true power of the Valente family, Dante. We did not just resort to crude violence. We accumulated knowledge. We understood that information is the one weapon that never, ever runs out of ammunition. So why are we still alive? Dante finally asked, his own voice barely a whisper. You served my father his evening wine. A drop of poison in the glass would have been simple. You stood beside me at dinner, and you could have easily plunged a steak knife into my heart. What was the point of this long wait? For a fleeting moment, Sophia's gaze fell upon the briefcase, her expression softening, revealing the shadow of the broken, 12-year-old girl who had watched her entire world burn to the ground. Because a quick death is a gift, she whispered, the words heavy with years of pain. Your father was responsible for my mother's end. He took the lives of my brothers. He set fire to the home I grew up in, turning it to ash. If I simply put a bullet between his eyes, he would have died a legend in our world. He would be remembered as the great Don Salvatore, a powerful man taken by a rival. Her head snapped up, and her eyes were 2 burning coals. I refuse to let him die a legend. I need him to die as a complete and utter failure. I want him to be forced to witness his entire criminal empire crumble, brick by painful brick. It is essential that he knows a Valente was the one who stripped everything from him. Not with a firearm, but with something far more devastating, the unvarnished truth. She placed a hand firmly on the briefcase. Inside this case is that truth, Dante. It is called the Libro Rosso. This book contains all the evidence, every last dirty secret detailing the collaboration between the 5 families and the corrupt senators, the compromised judges, and the union leaders on their payroll. If I choose to release this information, the Federal Bureau of Investigation will not just come for you. They will completely dismantle the entire corrupt ecosystem that allows you to operate. The powerful Moretti name will be reduced to nothing more than dust in the wind. Dante could only stare at the briefcase as if it were a bomb. That book is a ghost story, a myth. My father always told me it was destroyed in the fire that consumed your house. My father managed to throw it out of a 2nd-story window to Enzo just moments before the roof finally collapsed, Sophia corrected him flatly. Dante dragged a hand through his dark hair, feeling the walls close in. He was utterly trapped. He was standing in a filthy sewer next to a woman who possessed the power to annihilate his entire existence. To make matters worse, somewhere above them in the city, a traitor was actively hunting them both. So, Dante finally managed to say, his voice low and strained with tension. What is the next move? You release the contents of that book. I am sent to prison for the rest of my life. And you finally have the revenge you have craved for years. I cannot release it just yet, Sophia admitted with a hint of frustration. The files inside are protected by a complex encryption. The key is not something I can easily break. And the moment I surface and attempt to decrypt it, Rocco's death squad will find me. Now that they are aware you survived the attack, they will eventually find you as well. She pushed herself to her feet, a sharp wince of pain crossing her face as she put pressure on her injured left leg. We find ourselves in a difficult situation, Dante. We are supposed to be mortal enemies. By every law of our world, I should probably kill you right now and take my chances alone, and you should be trying to strangle me to death and seize that book. But, Dante interjected, taking a deliberate step closer to her, if we follow that path, Rocco is the one who wins. He will seize the throne, he will bury my father without honor, and then he will hunt us down individually until we are both gone. Exactly. Dante slowly extended his hand. The gesture was an act of pure insanity, a Moretti offering a handshake to a Valente. It was a direct defiance of 100 years of bloody history between their families. I propose a truce, Dante said, his voice firm. Just until we can survive this night, until we can confirm if Rocco is truly the one behind this. I will help you get to a place of safety. In return, you do not release the book. Sophia stared at his outstretched hand. She saw the network of scars across his knuckles from a lifetime of fights. Then she looked into his eyes. They were eyes that held a surprising kindness, especially for a man who was raised by an absolute monster. She made no move to shake his hand. I do not shake hands with Morettis, she said, her tone as cold as ice. But I will not make an attempt on your life tonight. You should lead the way, boss. You clearly know this city far better than I ever will. Dante let his hand fall to his side, a faint smirk playing on the corner of his lips. You are genuinely a terrifying woman. Are you aware of that? I am simply a waitress, she replied without a hint of emotion. Of course. And I am nothing more than a humble waste management consultant. Dante gestured down the long, dark tunnel. There is an exit that comes out near Chelsea. I own a safe house there, one that is not listed on any official records. Not even my father is aware of its existence. It is an artist's loft. I maintain it for my private time. You are referring to your mistresses, are you not? Sophia asked, limping just ahead of him. I am referring to my painting, Dante corrected her, his tone clipped. Sophia stopped and glanced back over her shoulder, her expression one of genuine astonishment. You paint? Everybody needs to have a hobby, Dante grumbled, pushing past her. Let us go, before the rats down here become any braver. They began to move together through the oppressive darkness, the two surviving heirs of a shattered kingdom, walking toward a new day that promised absolutely nothing but more bloodshed. But as they walked, the very dynamic between them started to shift. They were no longer the hunter and the hunted. They had become partners. And in the shadowy underworld, a partnership born from absolute necessity is frequently stronger than a marriage that was supposedly born from love. However, neither of them happened to notice the small, blinking red light located on the handle of the briefcase. It was not a bomb. It was a sophisticated tracking device. And far away, deep inside a luxurious penthouse with a view of Central Park, Rocco smiled as he watched the digital blip moving slowly beneath 10th Avenue. I have you now, Rocco whispered to himself, swirling the amber cognac in his glass. You kill the father, then you kill the son, and you bring the girl directly to me. That Valente witch is in possession of something that rightfully belongs to me. The safe house was absolutely nothing like Sophia had expected. She had been anticipating a cold, concrete bunker, a room with no windows and racks of firearms mounted on the walls, with simple mattresses thrown on the floor. Instead, Dante guided her into a vast, sprawling loft with high ceilings in the heart of Chelsea. The air inside smelled of turpentine and linseed oil, not of gunpowder and old blood. The walls were completely covered in stretched canvases, featuring enormous, chaotic, and strangely beautiful paintings. There were violent, expressive swirls of deep red and stark black, depictions of faces screaming without a sound, and desperate hands reaching out for a help that was never going to arrive. "You actually do paint," Sophia whispered in amazement, letting the heavy briefcase drop onto a spotless white sofa. She walked slowly toward a large canvas that was still sitting on an easel. The painting was not yet finished. It was a portrait of a woman who had the saddest eyes Sophia had ever seen. "It helps keep the ghosts quiet," Dante explained, as he locked the heavy steel door behind them and activated a complex keypad deadbolt. He then walked over to a small kitchenette and retrieved a fully stocked first aid kit. "Sit down. Let me take a look at that leg of yours." Sophia hesitated for only a second before she sat on the edge of the sofa. The rush of adrenaline from their escape was finally wearing off, and it was being replaced by a sharp, throbbing ache in her calf, where she had scraped it raw against the side of the pier. Dante knelt down in front of her. He carefully cut away the torn, blood-stained fabric of her waitress uniform using a pair of small medical shears. His hands, which she knew could be so dangerous, were now moving with incredible gentleness. "It is a shallow wound," he said in a low voice, dabbing a clean antiseptic pad on the raw skin. "You will not be needing any stitches." "You have surprisingly good hands," Sophia murmured, her eyes fixed on him as he worked, especially for a Moretti. Dante stopped what he was doing and looked up at her. Their faces were now only inches apart. The intense tension that filled the room began to change. It was no longer the desperate tension of survival. It was something else entirely, something magnetic and powerful. "And you," he replied softly, "have far too many secrets for a Valente." He finished applying the bandage to her leg, but he did not pull away from her. "Why did you really save me, Sophia? You could have easily let those mercenaries finish me. That would have been one less Moretti for you to ever worry about." Sophia's gaze drifted back to the painting of the sad woman on the easel. "Because I was watching you tonight, in the restaurant, right after your father insulted me in front of everyone. You flinched when he did it. I saw that you absolutely hated it. You are not him, Dante." "I am exactly like him," Dante said with a wave of bitterness, standing up and moving to the window to cautiously peer through the blinds. "I am the one who runs his businesses. I am the one who cleans up his terrible messes. I am the heir apparent to his throne." "You are a prisoner," Sophia corrected him, her voice soft but firm, "just as I was for so many years. We are both just the children of powerful men, left to clean up our father's bloody legacies." Dante turned away from the window to look back at her, a look of raw, unguarded vulnerability now on his face. For just a second, the powerful Mafia prince was gone. He walked back toward her, pulled by a force that he could not begin to explain. He reached out his hand, and his fingers gently grazed her cheek. Sophia did not pull back. Instead, she leaned into his touch, her eyes slowly closing. "If we manage to get out of this alive," Dante whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "I am finished. I will be leaving this life for good. I will take what money I have, and I will disappear." "There is no such thing as leaving," Sophia said with a deep sadness. "Not while a man like Rocco is hunting us, and not while that book still exists." Her gaze fell to the briefcase on the sofa. A sudden, chilling realization washed over her like ice water. "Dante," she said, her voice suddenly sharp and urgent. "The handle. What are you talking about?" "The handle of the briefcase. It feels warm to the touch." Dante's eyes went wide with alarm. He lunged for the case, quickly flipping it over. There, Embedded in the matte black steel near the hinge was a tiny, pulsing red light, no bigger than the head of a pin. "It is a tracker," Dante hissed. "A high-frequency model. How long has it been active?" Sophia was already on her feet, completely ignoring the searing pain in her leg. Dante quickly checked his watch. "If Rocco has been tracking us all the way from Red Hook, he is not going to be coming here by himself. He is going to bring the entire hammer down on us." A loud crack echoed through the loft as the skylight above them exploded into a shower of glass. It was happening in the exact same way Enzo had died. It was history repeating itself in the most brutal fashion. Ropes dropped down into the room. But this time, Dante was prepared for it. He grabbed Sophia and tackled her to the floor behind a heavy oak drafting table, just as the entire loft filled with choking tear gas. "Gas! Masks are under the sink!" Dante yelled, firing his handgun blindly over the top of the table. The main door to the loft blew inward off its hinges with a deafening boom. Through the swirling white smoke, several figures began to emerge. But these were not just ordinary mercenaries this time. Leading the assault, wearing a tactical gas mask that made him look like some kind of mechanized insect, was Rocco. And he was dragging someone with him. Dante squinted his eyes, trying to see through the stinging gas. Don Salvatore Moretti was thrown violently onto the floor in the center of the room. He was not bound, but he was completely disoriented, coughing violently from the gas. Rocco ripped his own mask from his face, smiling like a great white shark, as the loft's powerful ventilation system began to suck the remaining gas out of the air. "Come on out, Dante," Rocco shouted, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Come out and you can properly introduce your new girlfriend to your father." Dante glanced over at Sophia. "He is using him as a human shield." "No," Sophia said, her mind racing to process the scene. "This is much worse. He is setting a stage for a performance. He wants Salvatore to see the two of us together. He wants to frame you for all of this." "We have to finish this right now," Dante said grimly. He ejected his magazine to check it. "I only have 6 rounds left, and I count 10 of his men." "I have the book," Sophia said with resolve. "And I know the decryption code." She began to stand up. "Sophia, do not do it." Dante reached out for her, but she was already moving away from their cover. She walked out from behind the table with her hands raised in a gesture of surrender, the heavy steel briefcase held firmly in her left hand. "Hold your fire!" Rocco screamed to his men. He let out a triumphant grin. "Well, look at what we have here." The little waitress returns. Don Salvatore managed to push himself up onto his hands and knees. He looked incredibly frail and utterly confused. He looked up and his eyes fell upon Sophia. Then he saw his son, Dante, emerging from behind her, his own gun now raised. "Dante," Salvatore rasped, his voice hoarse. You are with her? You have sided with a Valente? He told you that I kidnapped her, did he not?" "Don Salvatore," Sophia said, her voice remaining perfectly calm and steady. The accusation was a gunshot, echoing through the vast, empty loft. Sophia advanced cautiously until she stood a mere 10 feet from Rocco, a silent witness to the family's implosion. "He told me," Salvatore spat, his voice regaining some of its venomous fire, "that my own son betrayed me. He swore you were selling our secrets to the Valentes, that you were planning to kill me and take the crown for yourself. Power is supposed to protect, but here, it was a weapon turned inward. Stay with me to see how it ends." "And you actually believed him?" Dante's voice was a raw shout of disbelief, his gun locked steady on Rocco's skull. "Papa, for God's sake, just look at him. He was the one who hired the Russians. He was the one who tried to have me killed at the pier." Rocco just smiled, a smooth reptilian calm settling over him. "Lies," he said, his voice like silk. He pressed the cold steel barrel of his pistol harder against Salvatore's temple. "Drop your weapon, Dante, or the old lion goes to sleep for good tonight." The entire room seemed to hold its breath. It was a perfect, deadly standoff, frozen in time. Dante was trapped. He couldn't possibly shoot Rocco without sacrificing his father in the crossfire. In that moment, Rocco held every single card. "Is this what you want, Rocco?" Sophia's voice cut through the tension as she lifted the heavy briefcase. "This is the prize you're after, isn't it?" Rocco's eyes locked onto it, filled with a ravenous hunger. "Give it to me," he demanded. "Hand it over, and I might just consider letting the boy live. As for the old man, well, his time is already up, one way or another." Sophia took another step. "You don't want the book for the leverage against the senators," she said, her voice rising with certainty. "That was never the real goal. You want it because of what is written on page 42. A flicker of movement in Rocco's eyes, a micro-expression of pure panic, was all the confirmation she needed. "What is on page 42? Salvatore asked, his gaze darting between them, desperate for the truth. "It is the complete list of all the skimming operations from 1995 to 2005, Sophia said, the lie rolling off her tongue with the weight of truth. She had no idea what the real page number was, but she knew the crime inside and out. She had pored over Enzo's hidden notes for years. "Rocco didn't just serve you, Don Salvatore. He was actively stealing from you, 10% off the top of every single shipment. He built his entire empire using the crumbs from your table." Rocco's composure finally shattered. "She is lying," he screamed, his finger tightening on the trigger, his face a mask of fury. "Kill them! Just kill them both right now!" "Wait," Sophia shouted over his rage. "Let me open it. I will prove every word." She carefully placed the briefcase on the dusty concrete floor. She knelt beside it, her hands steady. She spun the combination dials. 12, 25, 98. It was the date her family's home had been burned to the ground. Her father always had a dark sense of humor. The latches made a loud clicking sound. They popped open. Rocco took a single, greedy step forward, his caution completely overwhelmed by his avarice. He shoved Salvatore roughly aside, the old man stumbling, and aimed his gun directly at Sophia's heart. "Show me," he hissed. Sophia slowly lifted the lid of the case. Inside, there was nothing. It was completely empty. Rocco stared into the vacant space, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. "Where is it?" he whispered, then roared, "Where is the book?" Sophia looked up from the floor, and a terrifying, triumphant smile spread across her face. "I burned it 3 years ago, Rocco. The real leverage was never in the book." She slowly raised a hand and tapped her temple. "It has been in here the entire time." Rocco's face twisted into a grotesque mask of pure rage. "You!" He raised his gun, ready to execute her where she knelt. A single, deafening bang echoed through the loft. But the shot had not come from Dante's gun. Rocco stiffened, an expression of total, utter shock on his face. He looked down at his chest. A dark red flower was beginning to bloom on his shirt. The fabric was quickly turning crimson. He turned his body slowly, painfully, to see the source. Don Salvatore Moretti was standing there, his hand steady, holding a small .22 caliber pistol that he had pulled from a hidden ankle holster. It was the one and only place Rocco had forgotten to check. "You stole from me, Rocco," Salvatore whispered, his voice trembling not with weakness, but with a terrible, righteous rage. "You stole from my family." Rocco tried to speak, but only blood gurgled in his throat as he collapsed to his knees. I made you," he choked out. "You are nothing without me." Salvatore's face was stone. "You are nothing," he corrected. He fired the pistol one more time. Bang! Rocco's body hit the floor and did not move again. The remaining mercenaries, seeing their paymaster was now dead, exchanged uncertain glances. They were professionals, not loyalists. No check meant no fight. "Leave!" Dante roared, the command cracking like a whip as he waved his gun toward the shattered door. "Get out of here right now before I call the New York Police Department and have them clean this mess up." The mercenaries did not need to be told twice. They scrambled out of the broken doorway, their heavy boots thudding on the stairs as they vanished into the anonymity of the night. A profound silence returned to the loft, a silence that felt heavier and more suffocating than the chaos before. Don Salvatore stood over Rocco's body, his breathing ragged and heavy. The small gun slipped from his fingers and clattered on the floor before he slumped against a concrete pillar, the strength leaving his body all at once. Dante quickly holstered his own weapon and rushed to his father's side, catching the old man just before he could slide to the floor. "Papa," Dante said, his fingers immediately going to the old man's wrist to check his pulse. "Are you okay?" "I am old," Salvatore grumbled, pushing Dante's hand away with surprising, if weak, force. "I am not dead." He painstakingly adjusted the lapels of his coat, then slowly lifted his gaze. Sofia was still kneeling on the floor beside the empty, open briefcase. Salvatore used his cane, which Rocco had carelessly thrown to the floor, and tapped it against the metal case. "You lied," he rasped, his voice thin and dry. "You lied about the book." "I bluffed," Sofia corrected him calmly, rising to her feet to face him as an equal. "A Valente always knows how to play poker." Salvatore studied her then, his eyes narrowed. For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound was the mournful whistle of the wind through the broken skylight far above. He looked at her face, truly looked at it for the first time, and he saw the unmistakable ghost of Giovanni Valente staring back at him. "You have your father's eyes," Salvatore said, his voice now quiet and filled with a strange reverence. "And you have his stubbornness." "And you have a debt to pay," Sofia countered, her own voice perfectly steady, betraying no fear. "I saved your son's life tonight. I saved your entire empire from a traitor who was bleeding it dry, and I spared your life down in that sewer when I could have easily let you rot." Salvatore gave a slow, deliberate nod. "This is all true. The Omerta is clear on this. A life for a life." He reached deep into his coat pocket and pulled out a heavy, ornate gold ring. It was the Moretti signet, the symbol of his power. He looked from Dante to Sofia, his decision made. "I am tired, Dante," Salvatore sighed, the weariness of decades settling on his shoulders. "Tonight has shown me that I cannot trust the men I raised around me, but I can trust you," he said, his eyes now fixed on Sofia. "The feud between our families ends this night. The Valente family is gone. From now on, you are Sofia Rossi. You are a waitress, is that correct?" Sofia hesitated for just a moment. She glanced at Dante, and she saw a desperate, pleading hope shining in his eyes. A life with him was possible. "Yes," she said, her voice softening. "I am just a waitress." "Good," Salvatore said with a grunt of satisfaction. "My son needs a good woman by his side, not another soldier. But," he warned, narrowing his eyes, "if you ever dare to speak that dialect in public again—" The corner of his mouth twitched upward into something resembling a smile. "I will have to fire you." Dante burst out laughing. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated relief that filled the grim space with warmth. He wrapped a protective arm around Sofia's waist, pulling her tightly against him. "Let's get you home, Papa," Dante said. The grand reopening of Il Gio was the most talked-about social event of the season. The press was swarming outside, their camera flashes illuminating the politicians and celebrities who walked the red carpet. But the real power was seated at table 1 on the mezzanine. Dante Moretti sat at the head of the table. He was not wearing a business suit. He wore a perfectly tailored tuxedo, but his tie was already loosened. He looked relaxed, and for the first time, truly happy. Don Salvatore sat to his right, looking frail but undeniably content as he sipped his expensive Barolo. "The service here has certainly improved," Salvatore commented, his eyes scanning the bustling floor below. "That is because I have a new manager," Dante said, a wide grin spreading across his face. Just then, Sofia approached their table. She was not wearing a simple waitress uniform. She was adorned in a stunning backless red dress that likely cost more than the old car she used to drive. She was not carrying a tray. She carried herself like a queen surveying her kingdom. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice smooth as velvet as she rested a hand on Dante's shoulder. "Is everything to your liking tonight?" "It is perfect, amore," Dante replied, lifting her hand to his lips and kissing it gently. Salvatore looked up at her, a critical expression on his face. "The wine is good," he announced, "but this bread is cold." Sophia did not even flinch. She leaned down, her lips right next to the old Don's ear, and whispered in a perfect, heavy Sicilian dialect, "You will eat the bread you are given, old wolf, or the cook will put you on a permanent diet." For a moment, Salvatore froze. Then he threw his head back and let out a laugh. It was a loud, booming, genuine laugh that caused the entire restaurant to turn and look. The sound of it was a proclamation. "She is terrifying," Salvatore told his son, wiping a joyful tear from the corner of his eye. "You must keep her." Sophia smiled, squeezed Dante's hand with affection, and then walked away to greet the other important guests. She was no longer invisible. She was now Sophia Moretti, the woman who had successfully tamed the lions of New York. And as she moved with grace through the crowded room, nobody dared to look away from her. And that is the story of how the shy waitress, who once trembled while pouring a simple glass of water, became the undisputed queen of New York City. She did not use a gun to win her war. She used her heritage, her sharp wit, and the one weapon the Mafia never saw coming: the unvarnished truth. Sophia proved that in a world full of savage wolves, the most dangerous creature is not always the one with the biggest teeth. It is the one who knows exactly when and where to bite. Sophia's journey teaches us something powerful. Never underestimate the quiet ones. The person pouring your water, the server you never look at twice, the nobody standing in the corner. They see everything. They hear everything. And when their moment comes, they can change the entire game. This story also reminds us that revenge is not always about destruction. Sometimes the greatest victory is choosing to rise above the pain and build something extraordinary from the ashes. Sophia could have killed Don Salvatore when she had the chance. Instead, she chose to become the queen of his empire. For those of you who have ever felt powerless, overlooked, or called nothing, remember Sophia. Your invisibility is your armor. Your silence is your strategy. And your moment to find your voice is coming. So, I have to ask you, what do you think? Did Sophia make the right choice by saving the very man who had destroyed her entire family? Or should she have taken her revenge when she had the chance? Let me know what you believe in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of betrayal, romance, and brutal Sicilian justice, please smash that like button, hit subscribe, and be sure to ring that notification bell so you never miss a new story. We have a new thriller coming out next week that you absolutely will not believe. Thank you for watching, and remember to stay dangerous. This content was carefully researched, crafted, and manually edited by our team to bring you meaningful lessons and inspiration. Every story we share is designed to touch your heart and remind you of your own strength. Thank you for being part of our community.